Weight gain is the consequence of eating too many calories. And if we think that excess calorie intake is the root cause of weight gain, then the solution would seem to be counting calories so that we can restrict our calorie intake and lose weight. I am not a fan of this approach because it neglects why we are eating too many calories. I argue we need to understand the reasons for our overeating so that we can address them and lower our calorie intake without even trying. One reason for overeating is clearly that our food often is not satiating per calorie consumed. To address this, we need to change the types of foods we're eating to include more foods that are highly satiating per calorie, which would then be expected to bring our calorie intake down without us ever counting calories or consciously restricting our food intake. So in this video, I will share 3 key characteristics that make foods more satiating per calorie. I will discuss a simple satiety score based on these characteristics, and I will share this poster here with the satiety scores of common foods that will make it easy for you to pick the right foods to help you prevent or reverse excess body weight without ever worrying about calories. Welcome to Nourished by Science on YouTube. My name is Mario, and on this channel I share evidence-based information about nutrition as it relates to the prevention of chronic disease. With this video, we're continuing our series on preventing and reversing insulin resistance. As I have discussed in this video, there are numerous factors that can cause insulin resistance. The most important factor in most people is excess body fat mass, and specifically excess visceral and ectopic fat. Therefore, understanding the keys to a healthy body weight will be critical to helping us maintain a healthy body weight and fat mass, or lose excess visceral and ectopic fat without immediately regaining it. So let's start by discussing how to think about satiety, calorie counting, dieting, and weight loss. This here is Anne. Let's assume it's lunchtime. Anne is hungry and sits down to eat. She eats until she is comfortably full. Now, what is it about her meal that changes her state from being hungry to being comfortably full? Anne may say that she needs a certain number of calories, let's say 600 kilocalories, in her lunch to feel comfortably full or satiated. Now, I say that this is a fundamental misunderstanding of how our body regulates hunger and satiety. Research shows very clearly that how much we eat in a meal is only partly related to how many calories that meal contains. For example, let me create 3 different lunches. Let's call them lunch A, lunch B, and lunch C. I'll tell you later what these meals may look like and what their characteristics are. For now, let's just say we have 3 very different meals. And let's say I conducted a research study and served each of these to Anne on different days in random order. Each time I would ask her to eat until she was comfortably full. Now, what is interesting is that she wouldn't necessarily eat exactly 600 kilocalories of each meal. The data that I'm going to share with you later in this video suggests that she may eat 500 kilocalories of lunch A, 800 kilocalories of lunch B, and 1100 kilocalories of lunch C. So she'd eat more than twice as many calories if she were served lunch C compared to lunch A, even though she ate to satiety each time. Now, if Anne usually eats meals that are similar to lunch C, she will gain weight. If she wanted to lose that excess weight, she may think that the solution is to count calories she's eating and reduce her calorie intake by some amount. For example, she may decide to continue eating her normal lunch C, but only half of it, because her calorie counting has shown that half a portion would be a more reasonable number of calories. And for sure, in the short term, this may work and Anne may lose a few pounds. The problem is, this never works in the long term because there is a reason she eats 1100 kilocalories of lunch C. Lunch C is not very satiating per calorie, meaning she spontaneously eats a lot more calories to feel the same level of satiety as with lunches A and B. So if she only ate half of lunch C regularly, she'd feel hungry all the time, which would make her miserable and very difficult to stay on this diet for an extended period of time. Understanding why Anne eats such different amounts of calories depending on whether she eats lunch A, B, or C holds the key to understanding why we overeat, and also how we can lose weight and have a chance to keep it off. Anne gained weight because she ate foods that were not very satiating per calorie, so she needed to eat more calories to feel comfortably full. So of course the number of calories she ate matters, but the solution is not to count calories and consciously cut calories. Anne should not focus on calories at all, in my opinion, but instead change the types of foods she eats, because the foods she eats were the problem in the first place. There are 3 characteristics that determine how satiating a food or a meal is per calorie, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video. Let's get started with satiety factor number 1. A high protein content. Remember the last video in which I shared that if you sit down to eat a meal, you're going to eat significantly more calories overall in that meal if that meal includes an alcoholic or sugar-sweetened beverage. This here is the opposite of that. We know that if you sit down to eat and the meal has a high content of protein, you will require fewer calories until you stop eating because you are comfortably full. More specifically, we can say that a meal with a higher percentage of total calories as protein is more satiating. This is nicely apparent here in this meta-analysis, meaning a study of studies. These authors combined data from 44 published feeding studies in which participants ate different diets that differed in the relative amounts of protein, carbohydrates, and fats. In all studies, the investigators measured total energy intake in calories here on the y-axis. The x-axis shows the percent protein relative to total energy intake. Each dot is actually the average from a group of participants from one specific diet in one of these 44 studies. So this graph represents data from thousands of individual participants. What we can see nicely in the red dots is that across these studies, participants ate fairly similar amounts of calories from protein independent of the protein content of the diet. Right here on the x-axis, natural human diets tend to almost always provide 10 to 30% of total calories in the form of protein. And what you can see is that no matter how low or high the protein content of these test diets was, participants always ate around 400 to 500 kilocalories worth of protein per day. Given that protein has 4 kilocalories per gram, that means participants across these studies aimed to consume around 100 to 125 grams of protein per day. And whenever the protein content in the diet was low, such as 10 or 12% of total calories here, participants needed to eat a lot more food and, as a result, more calories to reach these 100 to 125 grams of protein intake per day. See these blue dots here now. These represent total calorie intake on these diets. And we can see clearly that participants tended to eat more calories overall whenever the protein percentage of the diet was low. These data are in line with the protein leverage hypothesis by my colleagues, Drs. David Raubenheimer and Stephen Simpson, who have proposed that organisms, including humans, do not just have an appetite for calories, but also for protein. And throughout their careers, they have assembled quite a bit of data in support of their hypothesis, and could show that a wide variety of species, ranging from fruit flies to insects to all kinds of mammals, tend to eat more calories whenever the protein content of their food is low. So if we tend to spontaneously eat less food and fewer calories if our diet has a higher protein percentage, then we should be able to lose weight more easily on such high protein diets, right? And looking at the data, I'd say we have moderate support for this idea, with several studies showing greater reductions in body weight or fat mass in participants following a high protein diet compared to a low or medium protein diet. The biggest issue in some of these studies is poor compliance. I've discussed this in more detail in the blog post, but I'd say that in many studies, people were unable or unwilling to follow a high-protein diet for an extended period of time, and substantial weight loss was seen only in those who were able and willing to stick to the high-protein diet in the long term. The lessons we can learn here from the scientific literature are that protein-rich diets reduce calorie intake and probably also are more effective at reducing body weight and fat mass in the long term than low protein diets, if we're able to stick with them. And by the way, high protein diets can also help with weight loss by very mildly increasing energy expenditure. And there are also data to suggest that they can attenuate some of the negative effects of weight loss, such as a loss of muscle mass and constant hunger. However, if we go back to this diagram here, pay attention to the blue dashed line. That line summarizes the average calorie intake at every level of protein intake across all of these studies. The first thing to take note of is that on average, spontaneous calorie intake goes down when protein percentage goes up. The second point, however, is that at any given level of protein intake, there is a lot of variation in calorie intake, right? According to these data, some people who were served diets containing 17% of energy from protein ate around 1,500 calories per day, while others ate about 3,500 calories per day. That difference is explained by other characteristics of these diets, some of which we'll address later in this video, while others will be covered in the next video. Suffice it to say that protein is just one of many factors that explain how much we eat. But it is an important one, so what do I concretely suggest? Well, let's stick with this diagram, and we see that increasing protein intake is particularly important at the low end of protein percentage, right? Increasing the percentage of our diet from 10 to 15% would have a dramatic effect on calorie intake in the average person, all else being equal. So my strongest recommendation is that if you currently eat a diet that is very low in protein, which may be the case for those of you who eat a lot of ultra-processed foods or who are vegetarian or vegan, try to make sure that you incorporate at least a small serving of a protein-rich food in every meal you eat. In general, I think it's reasonable to aim for at least around 20 to 25 grams of protein per meal if you are a small lady, or 40 to 50 grams per meal if you are a large gentleman. That would translate to a protein content of 18 to 20% of your total calorie intake. A bit more would be fine as well, but I think that getting up to that level would make your diet as a whole a lot more satiating if you are currently getting less than that. Now, what does 20 to 25 grams of protein or 40 to 50 grams of protein look like? I've made this little poster here that shows the amounts of different protein-rich foods you would need to eat to get 10 grams of protein. Just an ounce or two of most meats or fish, a couple of eggs, or 3 to 4 ounces of cottage cheese or Greek yogurt. Legumes such as lentils, beans, or soybean products such as tofu are other great sources. Nuts are as well, but just like full-fat cheese, nuts have one characteristic that makes these less ideal for what we're discussing here, namely how to maximize satiety per calorie. We'll get back to this later in the video. I've included this sheet here in the downloadable PDF files showing the satiety scores of common foods, which we're going to discuss later in the video. Check the description box below the video for information on how to download it. And with that, let's move on to satiety factor number 2, a high fiber content. Just like what we discussed for protein, spontaneous calorie intake tends to be lower when a meal is high in fiber compared to a similar meal low in fiber. This short-term effect translates to less weight gain or even weight loss over time when people eat high-fiber diets, in most studies at least. There are some inconsistencies in the literature because most randomized controlled trials in this field used a specific fiber supplement, and some types of fiber seem to be more effective at helping reduce calorie intake and body weight than others. But in general, what the data suggests is that soluble fibers, and specifically viscous fibers, are most effective at lowering calorie intake and body weight. Examples of foods rich in soluble fibers include vegetables, fruit, berries, legumes, such as lentils and beans, and whole grains. In general, these are also the types of foods that have the highest total fiber content, so I think it's easiest to simply eat more fiber overall, from a variety of sources. That's not to say I'm strictly against using fiber supplements. They can have their place. However, I don't think it's a healthy approach to eat a poor diet and then try to make up for that by taking a bunch of supplements. So I recommend incorporating a variety of whole, ideally unprocessed or minimally processed whole foods rich in different kinds of fiber into our diet, ideally into every single meal. I've again prepared a little poster that shows some of the most fiber-rich foods with information on how much of each you'd have to eat to get 5 grams of total fiber. Among the most fiber-rich foods are fruit and particularly berries, non-starchy vegetables, but also, not shown here, some starchy vegetables such as carrots, squash or beets. Then mushrooms in general and particularly legumes such as lentils and beans, as well as whole grains. Nuts also have quite a bit of fiber, but again, let me emphasize that nuts are not so great in another way. And that brings us to satiety factor number 3, and that is a low energy density. Energy density is the number of calories per gram of a food or a meal. So a pure oil or fat or pure starch or sugar will have a lot of calories per gram, specifically 9 kilocalories per gram for a fat or an oil, and 4 kilocalories per gram for a carbohydrate, such as starch or sugar, and also for a pure protein. I like to express energy density as kilocalories per 100 grams of a food, just because it's a bit more intuitive to think about 100 grams of a food than 1 gram portions. Foods can have an energy density between 0 kilocalories per 100 grams for water and 900 kilocalories per 100 grams for a pure oil or a fat. Mostly foods will have high energy density if they are low in water and high in carbs, protein, and particularly fat. And that brings us back to nuts and seeds. I mentioned earlier that these are rich in protein and also in fiber, but they have another characteristic that makes them less ideal for the purposes of maximizing satiety per calorie. And that characteristic is a very high energy density. See here, almonds as one example have an energy density of 587 kilocalories per 100 grams because they have almost no water and a lot of both fat and protein. So if you just eat a handful of almonds, you could very easily ingest 135 kilocalories. Instead, you could eat an entire pound of strawberries, which is also 135 kilocalories, but with a much lower energy density of 32 kilocalories per 100 grams. Or an entire small cabbage, or 1.7 pounds of tomatoes, or a small piece of grilled salmon, or a bowl of Greek yogurt. Or imagine you wanted a little snack. You could have a few almonds, or a bowl of Greek yogurt with half a pound of strawberries. Have a guess, what would leave you more full for longer? The research on this topic is more than clear. To date, there have been at least 38 randomized controlled trials investigating the impact of eating meals with a high energy density compared to meals with a low energy density. And extremely consistently, people eat a lot fewer calories without being asked to restrict their food intake whenever their meals have a low energy density. In fact, studies show that the weight of the food we eat in a meal tends to be roughly the same over time. So as the energy density of a meal increases, there's a linear increase in calorie intake in that meal. If we compare complex meals across all of the available studies, we can say that if one meal has an energy density that is 100 kilocalories per 100 grams higher than the other, then on average people will eat about 260 kilocalories more of that one meal. These are huge effects, so we can assume that even a small difference in energy density will have a large impact on calorie intake and body weight in the long term. It's therefore not surprising to find that randomized controlled trials do consistently find that people lose weight when they're randomized to a diet characterized by a low energy density. Foods with a high energy density include all of those that have little water and a high content of fat and or sugar. First and foremost, this applies to most ultra-processed foods. You know, all of the packaged stuff that doesn't contain individual foods, but isolated components of foods, such as high fructose corn syrup, sugar, and added fats and oils, usually with a cocktail of artificial colors, flavors, binding agents, emulsifiers, and so forth. These include most things in packages from the middle of the grocery store, such as chips, sugary breakfast cereals, packaged donuts and cookies, frozen pizza, ice cream, etc., etc. Quite energy dense are also some natural or minimally processed foods such as nuts and seeds, and cheese, as I mentioned, and most processed or very fatty meats such as salami or bacon. Foods that have a low energy density are those whole foods that contain a lot of water and not all that much fat or sugar. Vegetables of all kinds, leafy greens, legumes, mushrooms, fresh fruit and berries, and all lean types of fish, seafood, and meat tend to have a fairly low energy density. These are what I would consider the three most important factors that make a meal more satiating per calorie: a high protein content, a high fiber content, and a low energy density. Each factor by itself can make a meaningful impact on how many calories we eat in a given meal, but they are most powerful if combined together. So next, let's talk about the Nourished by Science Satiety Score. I've tried to make this very simple. The satiety scores range from 0 to 100, with 0 indicating very low satiety per calorie and 100 indicating high satiety per calorie. To clarify, 0 does not mean you will never get full from the food. It just means you will eat many more calories before you feel full than if you ate a higher satiety score food. For example, let's assume you ate either one small bowl, 100 grams of boiled potatoes, and another day you ate a small bowl, again 100 grams of French fries. You would probably argue that French fries are more satiating, more filling, and you would be correct. 100 grams of French fries have 323 kilocalories, whereas 100 grams of boiled potatoes have 78 kilocalories. So of course, you would feel more full after eating the French fries because that difference in calorie content is huge. However, if we calculate the satiety score based on protein content, fiber content, and energy density, boiled potatoes have a satiety score of 66, while French fries have a satiety score of 20. What this means is that the data tell us that boiled potatoes are much more satiating per calorie consumed, and that if you included boiled potatoes in a meal, you'd likely eat less calories overall than if your meal contained French fries. Because after all, to get 323 kilocalories, you only need 100 grams of French fries, but you could have more than 4 bowls of boiled potatoes. So, in other words, foods with a high satiety score generally are expected to spontaneously lower our overall calorie intake without us counting calories or paying any attention to calories, while foods with a low satiety score would be likely to lead to a higher calorie intake. I hope this makes sense. Let's review the satiety scores of a few common foods. We find the lowest satiety scores among oils and fats, as well as sugars, syrups, and other such sweeteners, including honey. These all have extremely low satiety scores between 0 and 13. It's probably not surprising that we also find extremely low scores in foods that are rich in fat and or sugar, such as mayonnaise, salad dressings, potato chips, French fries, donuts, ice cream, and candy bars. Sugary beverages do look reasonably good by comparison, with satiety scores around 30. However, as we discussed in the last video, sugar in the form of beverages is in a category of its own and absolutely raises calorie intake and body weight. So mentally, we should downgrade sugary beverages and also alcoholic beverages some more, simply because the evidence clearly suggests that liquid calories are less satiating than calories from solid foods. Let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum. We find the highest satiety scores among non-starchy vegetables, mushrooms, and leafy greens. Again, maybe you would argue that these kinds of foods are not very filling. And of course, they're not. No one who is very hungry will be happy to be served a bowl of fennel. But relative to their extremely low calorie content, they are much more filling than most other foods. In other words, if you had a meal of, say, meat and potatoes by themselves, you would likely eat a lot more calories than if you first had a salad and then served some mushrooms and broccoli with the meat and potatoes. Also among the high satiety foods are starchy vegetables, which have a higher satiety score if they are boiled in water as opposed to baked, simply because baking removes some of the water and makes the food more energy dense. Very high satiety foods are also legumes, such as beans and lentils, and all kinds of fruit and berries. We also find high or very high satiety scores in fish and seafood and unprocessed meats. Important here is that they are not breaded and deep fried, but simply cooked or grilled. Frying in a bit of oil is certainly an option, but that would lower the satiety score, depending on how much fat is added. Eggs, and particularly egg white, as well as Greek yogurt and also cottage cheese, have very high satiety scores. The higher fat dairy products have a lower satiety score, with full fat cheese having mostly lower scores. As with nuts and seeds, I wouldn't suggest that no one should ever eat cheese, but again, I do think it's important to keep in mind how energy dense cheese is and to pair it with other, more high satiety foods. We find middling satiety scores among grains. Generally, the satiety scores of whole grains are a little bit higher than those of refined grains because of the higher fiber content. And grains that are cooked by boiling in water, such as rice or quinoa, tend to have a higher satiety score than those that are baked. That's due to a difference in water content and energy density. By the way, I've created this and similar posters not so that you'll need to first consult several posters whenever you want to eat something. These are meant as learning tools for you to concretely understand, fundamental issues so that later you can intuitively apply it. You can find a link to download the poster in the description box below this video. Let's wrap this up by going back to Anne and the example lunches A, B, and C we talked about earlier. Remember that Anne doesn't count calories or even care about calories. She just grabs whatever lunch she can get and eats until she's comfortably full. I claimed that depending on which foods Anne chooses to eat, she will eat vastly different amounts of calories. In this made-up example, I suggested that she may eat anywhere from 500 to 1100 kilocalories in one meal. Now, what would such meals look like that trigger low versus high calorie intake? Well, if we use the satiety scores to design these meals, then meal A may consist of a grilled chicken breast with some broccoli, cooked quinoa or rice, and some fresh fruit or berries for dessert. Overall, this meal has a very high satiety score of 73, and the key point to understand here is that even if Anne had access to unlimited amounts of this meal, she would have a hard time overeating calories because of the specific properties of these foods. They are very rich in protein, they're very rich in fiber, and have a very low overall energy density. So if she just ate until she was comfortably full, she may eat somewhere around 500 kilocalories. Lunch B may consist of a lasagna with cheese, a small tomato salad, and a chocolate pudding for dessert. Now, this is still a pretty good meal with an overall satiety score of 48, but it does contain some lower satiety score foods such as cheese and pudding. My educated guess is that Anne may eat quite a few calories more of this meal than of meal A, maybe around 800 kilocalories. And then lunch C would be a typical fast food dish of a cheeseburger, some fries with ketchup, and a donut for dessert. This meal includes almost only low satiety foods, and again, if Anne could eat unlimited amounts of this until she was comfortably full, I think it's not unreasonable to think she may eat well more than 1,000 kilocalories of these foods. If she had a sugar-sweetened soda with this meal, as is so often the case with fast food meals, her calorie intake may go up even more. Because remember from the last video, liquid calories are mostly just added on top of solid food categories. Summary and conclusions. Taken together, one key to a healthy body weight is to utilize characteristics that maximize satiety per calorie consumed, helping us eat fewer calories while still eating until we're comfortably full. 3 key characteristics are a higher protein content, a higher fiber content, and a lower energy density. While each individually lowers ad libitum calorie intake and body weight in clinical studies, combining the 3 could have a very meaningful impact on the weight trajectory in the long term. For anyone who wants to prevent weight gain, I would suggest eating mostly foods with a satiety score of, say, 30 or higher. In other words, to be very careful with those low satiety index foods listed on page 2 of the satiety score poster. For anyone who is overweight and wants to lose some weight, I would suggest focusing on foods with a satiety score of around 40 or even 50 and higher, and being really careful with added oils and fats, added sugars and condiments and dressings. My philosophy here is that if we incorporate some of these factors into most of our meals, that will do wonders to our long-term weight trajectory while still leaving some room for some treats and just an uncomplicated enjoyment of the food we're eating. If then we also combine this knowledge about the satiety index of foods with what we will discuss in the next video and minimize known factors that trigger overeating, I think we can say goodbye to calorie counting and just eat a variety of the foods we like until we're comfortably full. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. If this was helpful, please click the like button below and don't hesitate to let me know if you have any questions or comments. Again, if you'd like a copy of the Satiety Score poster, please click the link in the description box below this video. Take care. Bye-bye.